It is a beautiful day to be alive, and I'm so glad we have this time together. I'm Sana Laybourne, she, her. I am a professor, scholar, connector, and avid reader. I've always loved learning about what's happening in our social world and sharing that knowledge, especially over a good cup of coffee. And so here we are. Each week on Let's Grab Coffee, I catch up with experts from around the world who are investigating our most pressing social issues and common curiosities. Over the next hour, you'll learn about their inspirations, motivations, and of course, what they know about the world around us. Go ahead and grab your cup of coffee and get ready for an engaging and insightful conversation. May is Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, a nationally recognized heritage month established in 1992 to celebrate the histories, cultures, and contributions of Asians in America. Currently, there are over 22 million Asians across the U.S., representing a range of ethnic groups originating in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. Yet, oftentimes, the ways we think of Asian American history is tethered to the East and West coasts. But Asians in America have a long history in the Deep South, a history that has garnered growing attention. I'm thinking about recent documentaries like Far East, Deep South, and Blurring the Color Line, Chinese in the Segregated South, both of which examine the documentary filmmakers' personal family history of Chinese owned grocery stores in the South, one in the Mississippi Delta and one in Augusta, Georgia. How does knowing these histories help us have a fuller and richer understanding not only of Asian Americans, but also the South? And how might these histories be shaping our shared present and future? To explore these questions and more, today I'm joined by Dr. Shaolu Yu. Dr. Shaolu Yu is an associate professor of urban studies and the chair of Asian studies at Rhodes College. She is an urban geographer holding a BS in resources, environment, urban planning, and management, an MS in urban geography, and a PhD in geography. Trained as an urban geographer in an interdisciplinary background and participating in projects in urban studies in China, the US, and Canada, she has developed a comparative and global perspective and a mixed method approach in her research on cities. Her papers have been published in the journals Annals of Association of American Geographers, The Professional Geographer, Urban Geography, Geographical Review, and the Journal of Transport Geography. Dr. Yu's current research interests include urban space and placemaking, migration and mobility, race and ethnicity, and Asian urbanism. She is interested in applying cartography and GIS and visualizing and analyzing spatial data. Her ongoing research projects include triangulated between white and black, Chinese in the Mid-South, and urban queer space in the South. She joins us today. Hi, Shaolu. So glad to have you
Hi,
here.
so happy to be here. What an honor.
Yes. Oh,
Yeah.
it is an honor for us to have you chatting here today. I'm just so excited that we got this chance to sit down and really talk about this phenomenon of Chinese owned grocery stores in the South. So I'm really excited about being able to delve into this topic because it's something that I think a lot of us, this is new information.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you even came to this idea. Like, how did this even come onto
Yeah.
your radar?
Yeah. So, I had to start from when I was in graduate school at the University of Connecticut as an urban geographer. And at that time, I was very deeply engaged in my dissertation, which was looking at the Chinese immigrant community in New York City. It was in Flushing, Queens, New York City. And at that time, it was the largest Chinatown in North America. And the population I was mostly um, writing about was the newly arrived immigrant, Chinese immigrant, who didn't, most of them didn't speak English, and some of them are undocumented immigrants. So after I was wrapping that project up and I was on the job market, and luckily I got a position here at Rose College in that was in 2015, uh, almost 10 years ago. It
Wow.
was a long time ago. Yeah, I know. And so I was starting to research, okay, so how did I translate my passion about documenting immigrants, documenting Asian American experiences from Northeast to the South? So I found this book by James Lowen at that time, and it was first published book, I believe, on Chinese in the South.
Mm.
And it was published in 1970s.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a new edition. So that kind of opened up my curiosity about, oh, wow, there are Chinese people in the South. So after I came here, Asian American at that time had not much like as big as momentum as we have now, but there were also still like gatherings and everything. I remember I attended one that was held in, now it is Dim Sum King, but at that time it
Mm.
was called Asian Palace. And when I entered the room, I was greeted by a person called Frida Kwan, and who is identified as the second generation Chinese American who grew up in one of those grocery stores in the South.
Mm.
And she spoke a very, very strong Southern drawl.
Oh
And
yeah.
it captured my attention immediately. And she ended up to be the reference person, the community person who opened up the whole world for me. And she's very
Wow.
well connected with the local community. Everybody knows Frida, and so she introduced me to different her friends and families. I was invited to family dinners and just sat with them and talk about the Chinese grocery stores. And we took several field trips in the South and just to identify these Chinese stores. And and there was also Chinese association and the club that they opened, for Saturday dancing and for
Hmm.
socializing. It was a very, very vibrant community. Yeah, so that all started my project. That
Wow,
yeah.
what a start. I love that, having, your expertise, right? What you were trained in, but then coming here to Memphis, to Rhodes College. And how wonderful is it when we stumble upon a book
Mhm.
that then kind of opens our imagination and gets us to thinking about, wait a minute, what's going on, in this place or in this space. So I love that. And of course, that connection through a shared meal. I'm always
Yes,
thinking
yes,
about food.
yes,
And
absolutely.
even, yes, and even as you write about in one of your articles, thinking about those shared food practices,
Mhm.
if we
Mhm.
think about and take a step back into history and the time period of these Chinese owned grocery stores and the shared food practices between the owners and the Chinese community, and particularly the Black community where these grocery stores were. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit, kind of like set the scene for us when we're talking about Chinese owned grocery stores in the South or in the Delta. What time period, what is going on in the US at that time that's kind of leading to this phenomenon happening?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Chinese arrived in the Mississippi Delta region dating back to late 1900. And at the time, first documented actually in details at that time it's called the Memphis Daily Appeal, and now it's the Commercial Appeal. In 1860s, there were a series of articles documenting what it was called the Chinese Convention, and it was held in downtown. And it was all these plantation owners, white plantation owners, right, from South Carolina, from Georgia, from Alabama, Arkansas, Tennessee, Mississippi, gathering together, right, during this era that of Black emancipation, right, that Black enslaved people got freedom, right, and then there was a fear among these white plantation owners that, okay, so what do we do with our cotton plantation? Where do we find cheap laborers? And their first thought was going to Chinese immigrants, right? And also Mexican immigrants. And how do we import them to work in the cotton plantation, still maintain this slavery system? So
Mhm.
that started the conversation. Let's, import the Chinese to the South. And there were a few experiments being done at that time, scattered around the plantation in the South. And there were some Chinese immigrants migrated here to work in the cotton plantation, but not on a large scale. And there
Mm.
were various reasons for that. And first of all, at that time, Chinese who wanted to migrate here and who had means to migrate here were actually not the poor people in China, and
Right.
their purpose was like come here and save money, get money, and then migrate back and retire back in China. So
Mm.
the harsh conditions working in the cotton plantation, the meager wage at that time was not sufficient for them to, keep working in cotton plantation. There were a lot of resistance actually happening among these laborers to fight against these harsh working conditions. And that was for one. For two, there was resistance from the North too, is that, we already wanted to abolish the slavery system, and we don't want to, eh, rebuild this like slavery
Right.
systems, right? So among the immigrants. So that was, a few reasons for that plan didn't work out. But it was the starting point where Chinese started to land in the South. And then a few years later, the transcontinental railroad was
Hmm.
finished. And then the Chinese immigrants who finished that project um, was thinking, where should I, move to, right? Where should I start the next chapter? So some of them actually stayed in the South after the
Mm.
completion of the railroad. And there were a variety of other venues that Chinese like landed, and there were some records that there was also a plantation system in the Caribbean at that time, right? That hired the
Hmm.
coolies, Chinese coolies, right? Basically, same slavery system as well. And some of them actually migrate from the Caribbean and to New Orleans and
Hmm.
rode the steamboat upstream and landed in the Mississippi Delta. So all these kind of various different stories that, and then it's like a very um, immigrant story, right? One
Hmm.
person came here, established grocery store, and they helped their families, cousins, and relatives, and all came
Hmm.
here and grow this business. And so there was a strong co-ethnic support um,
Hmm.
at that time. And why Chinese grocery stores in the Black community? Because at that time the Chinese were not allowed to occupy white spaces, and what they could do is they cohabit with the Black community, and at that time Black community is just out of slavery, not for not a long time. So there was very, very rare cases that Black communities actually establish grocery stores. And during the Jim Crow era, right, Black communities could not go to the white grocery stores. So, but they were very well welcomed in the Chinese grocery stores. That kind of a short version of how this Black Chinese spaces, of grocery stores around food, right?
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, thank
yeah,
you so much for sharing, just that brief kind of synopsis
yeah,
of
yeah,
the history. Of course, we could go way more in depth,
yeah,
but thank you so much for that because I think for a lot of people, when we think about Asian Americans in our history or in our imagination of the US's past, we think about the Transcontinental Railroad or we think about Gold Rush, right? Those are some of the kind of anchoring points that we have, and then we don't really know much else about
right,
Asians in America
right,
until kind of fast forward. Maybe we've heard about Japanese internment, right? But that might be kind of it. And so even that piece of even connecting how Chinese migrants working on the Transcontinental Railroad, okay, what happened to them after that? Well, a lot of
right,
folks were
right,
here, ended
yeah,
up,
yeah,
having their stopping place here and decided, okay, this is where, as you mentioned, the next chapter of my life will unfold here in the South.
yeah. Yeah, can I add one more thing?
Of
Speaking of the
course.
Chinese immigrants land in the South, there were, as I mentioned, there were co-ethnic support, right? At that time, actually, while we were doing our field trip with the local the Delta Chinese, and they took me to the Van Street, in
Mm,
downtown. There used to be a Chinese business association there on Van Street, and they were, holding weddings and mahjong parties, but they were also taking care of these newly arrived Chinese immigrants when they first landed he
mhm.
in Memphis. And there's one also in Greenville, Mississippi as well. So there's
Mhm.
spaces like that at that time, yeah, to support these Chinese immigrants. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think people don't know, of course, much about this history
Yeah.
and thinking about, okay, what were the pathways put in place? What were the community supports put in
Mhm.
place? What did that even look like, both past, but even oftentimes in the present too, particularly in a city like Memphis and many of the other cities or smaller towns throughout the Delta that some
Yes.
of your work looks at, where the Asian American population
Mhm.
is very small. And so even today, folks might not really think about the Asian American community members that they have.
Right, right. Yeah, exactly. Mhm.
So I'm really interested in if you could talk a little bit more about how some of the relationships between Chinese-owned Chinese grocery store owners and the Black communities that they were in, how did those relationships develop over time? You kind of mentioned how, of course, during this time period, Chinese folks weren't allowed to buy property or different things. So they were very limited spatially in where they could go, which also shaped their interactions. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about their particular community context, how that impacted their cross racial relationships or even interethnic relationships as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was very complicated and nuanced. So at that time, there was this racial, and even now, right, there's this racial hierarchy, white, Asian, Black, right?
Hmm.
And when the Asian community came here, and in the Jim Crow South, right, there's this really stratified Black and white. And when you go to water fountain, there's like labeled Black, white, colored, white. So it was usually very ambiguous, right, for the Chinese American Chinese immigrants who arrived here. It's like, what spaces do I occupy, right? Do I hop and do I sit at the front of the bus or the back of the bus? And so and for one of the strategy I would say, when you enter a racially stratified spaces. And if you want your kids to go to the better quality public school, you got to find ways to enter these white spaces, right?
Hmm.
And one of the various ways, of doing this, right? Like the Chinese community really mingled in the white Baptist churches at that time. And the Baptist churches and actively reach out to the Chinese immigrants at that time, right? Sunday come to our churches, right? So and the Chinese accepting that, right? Because in order to get more social mobility, social capital, then you have to mingle with the group that determine the social order of the society, right? That is
Hmm.
for one. For two, and Chinese also have to mingle with the Black communities, right? Because the Black communities were where they, you know, serve, right? Where the their economic means, right? So
Hmm.
and they live within the Black community, and so there's also the connection there, right? Much more based on the economic, more I would say than social at that
Hmm.
time. Um, so it was like, culturally, I would say that Chinese kind of maintain to themselves. There's like gatherings and co-ethnic support. Socially, they were trying to mingle with the white, and economically, they
Hmm.
depend on the on the Black community, on the Black customers that they serve. And so I would say that it's like complicated to kind of uh,
Yeah.
um, relationship, like, and there was very, very few at that time. There were very, very few interracial marriage at all.
Hmm.
Like the interracial marriage between white and Chinese and between Black Chinese and Chinese were frowned upon by the
Hmm.
Chinese community. Yeah. So, does that answer your question?
Yes. No, I think it speaks to how complicated and nuanced this
Yeah.
idea of belonging and identity really are. And there's not just one kind of clear-cut way to talk about it. Because as
Exactly.
you mentioned, all of us, we have these different contexts that we're a part of, where we live, where we work, where we worship, where we play, all these different
Yeah.
facets of where we go and where we might be accepted or where we might just be tolerated.
Yeah.
And depending upon, what vantage point you're looking from, you might have a different perception
Right.
of yourself, but also the other people that you're interacting with. And so I think that's really important to talk about. And I love that you mentioned that even though in this time period, Chinese folks were maybe going to church with white people and maybe living in a Black neighborhood and having and serving the Black community, that when it comes to those most intimate relationships, thinking about marriage and creating a family, there was no, right, there was no cross
Right.
racial marriages or
Right.
interracial marriages at that time, which speaks to, I think, some of the contextual barriers, structural barriers, and
Exactly.
of course, the broader racial attitudes
Yeah.
of that period as well.
Yeah, I would add that, yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned it. This is structural, this is contextual, right? As individuals, we come to a foreign country and trying to survive and adapt, that was what we had. But I would say that during my field trip, I was really moved by several occasions. That one time, a Chinese family was giving me a field trip in Lula, Mississippi, where there used to be like 4 or 5 Chinese stores on the main street, and most of their customers were Black customers. And when they took me to Lula, and that the towns, the grocery stores were no longer there. They were like the buildings were vacant, and they stopped to greet a Black family and their family member, their grandma, old grandma, was spending like was I think it was her 98th birthday party,
Wow.
and they were there. They were celebrating her 98th birthday, and it was like really you see these intimate connections, right? That they built and maintained this connection, even though these Chinese family moved away for years. And so there were moments like that. And there were moments actually I heard narratives from the Black communities where, they spoke fondly about the memories of going to these Chinese grocery stores, to get candies, to be greeted, by all the Chinese family. They're almost like this, like a family, relationship in all these, Black Chinese spaces. So that was one of the things that really struck me as well.
Mhm. And for your research, could you talk about where it took you? I know we're talking about the Mississippi Delta in the South, but like you mentioned, like specific towns. Where else did this research take you throughout the South?
Wow, the field trip was done a few years ago, and almost all over, like all the way from Memphis. There were Chinese grocery stores in Memphis at that time, and all the way stretching down to Natchez was where
Mm,
I went furthest at that time for my field trip, and all between Cleveland, Greenville, Lula, and there were all a few other small towns, and Marks, Mississippi, there were a few Chinese grocery stores there. So, and then there's also I did a separate few field trips to Arkansas, but they were all like in the Delta
mhm,
River Delta region where the cotton plantations were, right?
mhm,
So yeah, where that speaks to the economic foundation of these Chinese grocery stores, which was built in uh, as part of this plantation, economic system. So
mhm.
yeah.
And I think that's so important, just thinking about how our experiences are structured by physical space, right? So we're talking about the Delta and we're talking about specific time period and a
Mhm.
specific type of economy,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so when that cotton economy declines and other types of industry rise, then
Mhm.
we see, as you talk about in your research, we see, Chinese grocery stores kind of disappearing because
Yeah.
the economic landscape has changed. And so now, if we're thinking about more contemporarily, how do you see, that history of Chinese owned grocery stores? How do you see that still impacting the Delta region or even Memphis specifically?
Mhm.
Do you see any kind of vestiges of those relationships or that type of commerce today?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So a few things, and most of these grocery stores are no longer there, right?
Hmm.
And some of these grocery stores were actually inherited by the newly arrived immigrants from China, from other parts of Asia, and from Middle East. And they
Mm.
maintain these stores, but they are no longer the grocery store which used to sell, of fresh food, vegetables, meat, and all kinds of stuff, but more of a convenience store. And some
Right.
of them sells liquor. Uh,
Mhm.
so there was a kind of a transition there, right? And that is for one. And one of the major factors that contributed to the decline of these grocery stores are the big chain stores
Mhm.
like Kroger. And in Mississippi, there used to be Sunflower and also Piggly Wiggly, all these big chain stores that the owners were white, right? Had more economic means and on a larger scale supermarket, right? They almost like squeezed, they largely contributed to squeezing out these mom and pop Chinese grocery stores, right?
Mhm.
So, and on that, and I actually think a lot about what we talk about food desert in
Mm.
Memphis, especially in Memphis, and talk to my students about this too. The Mississippi Delta has really rich soil, right?
Yes.
And it has great agricultural potential. But how can you see on one hand there's rich soil on one hand, right? On the other hand, there's food desert, right? The
Yeah.
Black communities cannot access to the fresh food because there's no supermarket, there's no grocery stores, right? Where they can access to fresh food, right? Tell me one fresh, grocery store in Orange Mound, for example, where the Black communities can get fresh food, right? But
Mhm.
and then if you think about back then, in history, right? Like before the civil rights movement and before this big chain of grocery stores started to happen, the Chinese grocery stores were almost at like every corner of
Mm.
these Black communities, where the Black communities could go and get fresh food, vegetables, right? So that make me think a lot about, the food and feed, community, that relationship where with big industrialization food system, right? How we get food, where we feed each other, that is kind of a diverging away from a healthy way of living, from really the social equity, health equity perspective. So that is for one. And for two, I think part of that decline of Chinese grocery stores was because of the social mobility of
Mm.
Asian American immigrants too, right? The first generation came and they built a grocery store, and their kids could go to the university, got degree, and thanks to the civil rights movement, it elevated the Asian American um, status too, right, at that time, and also the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So the Chinese were gradually could move into this mainstream society, getting a job in, highly professional like universities or, accountant and pharmacy and all these jobs, right? And they no longer want to
Mm.
in these grocery stores. And so that also makes me think, there's, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Right. And the other part is this interracial spaces.
Mhm.
Um, and at that time, you did see, and I actually was thinking about, and the other paper that I was writing about is reflecting on the relationship between Asian and Black in the South during the Jim Crow era, and also the example in Los Angeles, what happened in the post-industrial era, right, in
Mhm.
Los Angeles between Korean community and Black community, right? And all started from Rodney King being beaten by a white police officer and recorded in the camera,
Mhm.
right? And that, like, are we go moving kind of backwards in these building interracial spaces? And I've been thinking a lot about that as
Mhm.
well. So um and all, like, the main goal for the paper is to argue for dismantling this, racial hierarchy, dismantling of white supremacists. And the first step is to uh, acknowledge our differences,
Mhm.
different racial group of different ethnic and racial groups, while building this solidarity and co-racial, cross-racial. spaces among Asian Black, Latinx, indigenous and queer, and yeah. So
Mhm.
that is, I don't know if that directly answered your question or that diverted
Yes.
question.
No,
Yeah,
that would, yes, because thank you so much for sharing that. Because when I think about, again, how kind of in mainstream US society, how we think about Asian Americans and our place as Asian Americans in society, it is often seen as, other, as, perpetual foreigner,
yeah,
as, not really integrated into the fabric of what we think about as American society. And that to our detriment, right? And thinking about, especially in that paper that you're referencing, and even what you shared with us now, the flows of Asian immigration and how new Asian immigrants, you come to this country, you're not aware of this long history of Asians in the United States and some of the histories of
right,
those race relations, both
right,
positive and negative, right?
right,
And so then how are you making sense of your own place in the US? And so
right,
it can sometimes be a bit of a challenge
right,
for us as Asians in America to really create those relationships, as you talked about, those
mhm,
cross racial, interracial solidarity movements,
mhm,
for us not knowing our own history, for other folks, not having that history, and then also the ways that our relationships structurally, might be separate, or there might be challenges for us to creating relationships because of the structures that exist.
right, exactly. And I'm glad that you mentioned that. And while I was finishing up the paper, it was right during COVID, and there was,
Mhm.
it was in the middle of rising anti-Asian racism during COVID, and it was really hard time. And um, to think about who I am in this country, am I going to be always a foreigner? Right. And this question, not, I arrived in the US when I was in 20s, and thinking about my community, right? The Frida Kwan, who was, the second generation in Mississippi Delta, and who spoke a Southern drawl, who doesn't speak any Chinese. And whenever she went out, and people asked like, "Where do you come from? How did
Mhm.
you learn Chinese? Why can't you use chopsticks?" Right? These questions. And oftentimes it was kind of heartbroken moment for her to just ask me like, when you look at me, do I look like Chinese?
Mhm.
So like when people ask me like, how where did you learn English? Your English is good. And it's okay for me because I didn't, grow up in this country. But thinking about people who have been here for generations, right? And just because they not look what is so-called typical American, right? And they were just asked these questions, they were denied of their identity, of their national identity, of their, it's really painful. Yeah,
Mhm. Yeah. You know, Definitely. I like that resonates so much with me as someone who, has grown up in the United States for the majority of my life. And again, those same questionings, right? So I definitely understand that feeling and how, alienating it can be when you're like,
exactly.
but this
Right,
is, where I'm from, right? This
right,
is my
right,
community,
right,
but not sometimes not being accepted as having a right to claim this as where I
right,
belong or where I can, contribute and be a
right,
part of.
right.
Your work on Chinese owned grocery stores in the Delta is a theme that, kind of as I mentioned in the intro, I'm seeing more of where Chinese Americans are individually being surprised to learn their personal family histories that connect them to the Deep South, as with the documentaries that I mentioned, Far East Deep South and Blurring the Color Line Chinese in the Segregated
Mhm.
South. But the Delta is not the only place where we see kind of these histories continuing to be explored and documented. I'm thinking about other initiatives to document Asians in the South and those histories, which I'm, excited to see, a growing momentum about documenting and amplifying these
Yeah,
histories. And I know you have some upcoming work that's continuing to expand
yes,
on
yes.
this idea. I'm wondering if you could kind of share with us a little bit about that.
Yeah, yeah, thank you for asking that. I'm so excited about this. So this project was partially funded by Mellon, and through Asian Network, which is a organization that connects all the Asian studies in liberal arts college. And there were two projects being selected, and one of them is going to be in St. Louis, Missouri. And we will be working with one faculty, Elsa Fan, from Webster University, and a community member in the Japanese community organization there in St. Louis. We're going to document API voices in St. Louis through digital storytelling. And
Mm,
I'm very excited about this, and for personal reasons, because, I was so focusing on the Chinese stories in the Mississippi Delta, but what about upstream to the Midwest geography, right? Upstream to along Mississippi River, what happened there? And what about the other API community story,
mhm,
right? I'm really, really eager to learn this part of geography and history and connecting the dots uh,
mhm,
of these less known stories, like you mentioned, right?
mhm,
In Midwest and in the South. So
mhm.
yeah,
Yeah, I'm excited to see and hear what you all uncover there because particularly we think about the Midwest and I know you're talking about St. Louis, but then also in Arkansas, and I'm thinking about because you mentioned like a Japanese American group there in St. Louis, which makes me think about Japanese internment and
right,
internment camps in the Midwest
yeah,
and how again how that impacted
yeah,
who ended up where, the types of businesses they may have opened or not, or just the type of economies they were a part of. And once again, that question of, where do folks kind of fit into the communities
right.
in the local spaces that they find themselves in?
Right, absolutely. And then there are two, speaking of identity, there are two layers, right? One is, how do we self-identify
Hmm.
comfortably, right? And where does the society feed us into, right? A lot of these, the anecdotal stories I've already heard from people in St. Louis is that some of them, even though you see them as, from outside, they are part of the API, but they don't necessarily identify as part of the API, or people who don't look like API, but they do strongly identify as part of the API community. So one of our goals is really identify these so-called outlier stories, right? That, to amplify these kind of marginalized voices. Yeah,
Hmm.
which I'm excited about. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought that up because when we think about this umbrella term of
Right,
Asian American Pacific Islander and who feels that they can claim that identity or find meaning in that identity, or as you mentioned, who is denied that
right,
identity because they don't quote look like what we think
right.
of as Asian American. And I think that's a big part of I will say our Asian American history of thinking
Yeah,
about, the vast range of Asian ethnicities and nationalities or ties to ancestral homelands that are a part of Asian American or feel like they're not a part of Asian America, but
right.
also those histories um, of interracial relationships also.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned like in the deep South, particularly in the times of, Jim Crow and even prior to that, interracial relationships were outlawed, but we do see instances of interracial relationships
Yeah.
and then how are those erased from our histories as well?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And on that note, I do want to add one story, a grocery store still there when I was doing my research field trip like 3, 4 years ago. And it was on the riverbank of Greenville, Mississippi. And the architecture style of that grocery store is blending in this Asian element. So you can never, miss it. And that store was actually owned by a interracial couple, the Chinese husband and a black wife. Yeah, and they were still their later generation, their children still run that store. And I could totally feel in the marginalized within the marginalized community, right?
Mhm.
Which was, as I mentioned, the interracial marriage was frowned upon by the Chinese community and at that time by Black community too. Yeah, so there were spaces. There were like I think as scholars that it is our responsibility to
Mhm.
document these unheard voices, these usually in mainstream we don't associate, right? We neglect and we ignore. Um,
Mhm.
and I think it is our responsibility to amplify these voices
Mhm.
and these spaces.
Well, yes, and I'm so glad that you are part of that movement to document and to amplify these voices. I see a lot more attention within the Asian American community of folks wanting to make sure we document, particularly these oral histories, as some of the elder generations, are, not with us or will soon to be not with us, right? And so capturing these stories
Yeah,
because many of these histories will be lost
right.
if we don't document them. You kind of mentioned the Mississippi Delta Chinese Heritage Museum in Cleveland,
Yes,
Mississippi,
yes.
which is a one great space that is, continuing that project of documenting these stories.
Yes, yes. I'm so glad you mentioned that. I want to encourage everyone to go visit the Chinese Heritage Museum in Cleveland, Mississippi, hosted in the archival buildings in Delta State University. It is a gem, a gem.
Yes.
Definitely don't miss it. Yeah,
Yeah. And
yeah.
are there other resources that you could share with our listeners if they're interested in learning more? Whether it is like a Delta Chinese Heritage Museum or even online resources that if folks are interested to kind of diving into this history more.
Yes, as kind of a scholar, nerd, as you mentioned, we're nerds, and I do want to recommend a few books that I found.
Yes.
Uh, and all these books that document the racial history in the South, but like focusing on the interracial
Hmm.
relationships. And this ones are particularly like a different shade of justice. Asian American civil rights in the South.
Oh,
Yeah, it like
yes.
Chinese was part one chapter of the story, but there were like Korean Americans, there were Indian Americans, and tracing back from the history, right? This is very good. And this one actually I particularly very also like was published in 2017, Nuevo South,
Hmm.
Latinos, Asians, and the remaking of place, mostly focusing on Arkansas.
Yes. I'm glad that you mentioned Nuevo South because I just recommended that book as well.
Oh, that's awesome. So I just got this book online,
Mhm.
Asian Americans in an Anti-Black World. And actually,
Oh,
I've cited this author, Claire Jean Kim.
yes.
My research was largely based on her racial triangulation theory in
Hmm.
1990s, and I'm eager to read this book. I think there should be more conversations, not easy conversations, because easy conversations don't get us anywhere. These we got to have these hard conversations, difficult conversations about these interracial spaces, about how we build solidarities um, and move this society to a better and equal and more just place. Yeah.
Yes, I absolutely love that. Thank you so much for sharing those resources. I am definitely going to have to pick up that book by Claire Jean Kim. I didn't realize that she had that book out. So
Yeah.
I'm learning something today too. And
Yeah.
like you, her theory of racial triangulation, a
Yeah.
lot of us as social scientists, draw upon that theory particularly in thinking about Asian Americans, right? Because that's what her focus is. And so I'm
Yeah.
just so excited to read more and learn more.
Yeah, I'm glad. I'm learning a lot too.
Yes. Look, and that is what this show is all about too, being able to learn together. Listeners, you're part of this learning process and this
Yeah.
conversation that we're having today too. Dr. Yu, I want to thank you so much for spending some time with us this morning and all of these great resources that you shared, and especially the work that you are doing. I can't wait to see how this next phase of your research unfolds, and I'll be looking forward to hearing more about what you find with the documentation of AAPI voices in St. Louis.
Thank you so much for having me, Sana, and I'm so honored to be here. And thank you for your great questions. I think I have a paper that I'm revising now. I'm gonna go back and incorporate all these questions that you make me think deeper about. So yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you again to Dr. Shaolu Yu for joining us this morning. I learned so much from our conversation, and this history of Chinese Americans in the Deep South is so fascinating, and I think really helps us rethink how we think about the South, how we think about Asian Americans and our place in the United States. And this is just one piece of Asian American history. There is so much more that we can learn together. I want to reshare the titles of the books that Dr. Yu mentioned: A Different Shade of Justice, Asian American Civil Rights in the South; Nuevo South, Latinos, Latinas, Asians, and the Remaking of Place; and Asian Americans in an Anti-Black World. I know I will definitely be picking up those titles that I don't already have in my library, and I encourage you to do the same. And then let's talk more about it. I want to end with something that Dr. Yu mentioned. She said, easy conversations don't get us anywhere. And oh, absolutely. And I'm just so thankful that we all have this time together to maybe open the door to thinking about how we might approach some of these more difficult conversations, but the conversations that are really important for us to talk about, to sit through as we want to co create the type of future where we are all seen, heard, celebrated. Make sure to subscribe to Let's Grab Coffee in podcast format so you never miss a conversation. And this also gives you the opportunity to share this show with a friend, but also to go back and re-listen as well. I know that I'm already going to re-listen to this conversation because Dr. Yu shared so much that I can't wait to really think more about and even learn more about. And I hope you do the same. What a wonderful time together this morning. You're listening to Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM Memphis. Every Monday, I'm here spending time with you, getting a chance to talk to experts from across the country, getting curious together. I hope you will join me back here next Monday morning.